Before missiles, tanks, and digital warfare, there was steel, blood, and kings who ruled through power and conquest. But how did ancient kings actually fight wars? Did they really lead charges on horseback, sword in hand? Or did they sit behind the lines while others died for them? The truth is far more strategic, brutal, and fascinating than you might think. From the battlefields of Mesopotamia and Egypt to medieval Europe and feudal Japan, this is the real history of how kings fought wars. In the ancient world, war wasn't just a military matter. It was personal for kings. A king's reputation, his honor, power, even his right to rule, was often built on the battlefield. Victory in war meant land, riches, and political dominance. Defeat could mean exile, humiliation, or death. That's why kings took warfare very seriously. They weren't just commanders. They were often considered divinely chosen, believed to be backed by gods or destiny. War was seen as their sacred duty, and sometimes that meant picking up the sword themselves. This is one of the biggest myths in history. So, did kings actually fight on the battlefield? The answer is sometimes yes, sometimes no. In early history, especially in places like Mesopotamia and Egypt, kings were expected to lead their armies in person, often in ceremonial armor. They'd ride in chariots, surrounded by elite guards, and make symbolic attacks. Think of it like a military parade that could suddenly turn deadly. In ancient Greece, kings like Leonidas of Sparta led by example, standing with their men to the death. Roman emperors, however, were a mixed case. While early rulers like Julius Caesar fought directly, later emperors often left the dirty work to generals. In medieval Europe, kings sometimes fought directly, like Richard the Lionheart, who led charges in the Crusades. But as time went on, kings became too valuable to risk in hand-to-hand combat. So they moved behind the front lines, commanding from towers, hills, or even tents, protected by layers of guards and scouts. Despite what movies show, ancient kings rarely won wars by sheer muscle. They won by strategy. Great kings surrounded themselves with trusted advisors, military generals, engineers, spies, and scholars. They planned logistics, troop movements, siege tactics, and supply chains. For example, Alexander the Great wasn't just a fearless fighter. He studied enemy cultures, terrain, and battle formations like a chess master. He used speed, deception, and terrain to trap enemies. Genghis Khan, despite being a Mongol warlord, was a military genius who used fake retreats, spies, and psychological terror to win without losing too many men. Napoleon Bonaparte, though later in history, studied historical kings' tactics. He emphasized mobility, surprise, and discipline, changing warfare forever. Long before computer maps or satellite intel, ancient kings relied on war tents, wooden maps, and messengers. In these war rooms, strategies were drawn on sand tables or carved onto wooden boards. Kings would move markers, representing troops, like pieces on a board game. Scouts and spies constantly fed updates about enemy positions, weather, morale, and terrain. Sometimes, false reports from spies or traitors would lead kings to disaster. For example, in the Battle of Agincourt, 1415, English King Henry V defeated a much larger French army by using muddy terrain and narrow fields, and by reading his scouts' intel correctly. One wrong decision in the war room could lose you your kingdom. Kings were high-value targets in battle, so they were never alone. Most kings traveled with elite personal bodyguards, sometimes known as the Royal Guard, Immortals, or Household Knights, depending on the region. These soldiers were the best trained, best equipped men in the kingdom. They protected the king, delivered messages, and fought around him like a human shield. If the king fell, panic would ripple through the ranks. That's why protecting the king's image, even if he wasn't near the fight, was a matter of morale. In many cultures, fake kings in armor were sent into battle as decoys to confuse the enemy. Ancient kings understood the psychological side of war. Their banners, war drums, shining armor, even the way they entered a battlefield was designed to intimidate. Egyptian pharaohs wore ornate gold helmets and rode chariots with divine symbols. Persian kings stood on golden platforms guarded by mythical animal statues. European kings led armies under massive flags and blessed swords, often claiming their war was a divine crusade. Kings rarely wasted a chance to remind their troops and their enemies who was chosen to rule. Not all battles happened in open fields. One of the most complex and brutal forms of war was the siege. Kings often had to capture fortresses, castles, or walled cities, and that took more than muscle. Siege warfare required engineers to build siege towers, catapults, or battering rams, sappers to dig tunnels and collapse walls, archers to rain fire arrows inside the city, psychological tactics like starvation or false promises. Some kings even used biological warfare, catapulting diseased corpses over walls. A siege could last months or years, testing a king's resources, patience, and politics. So, did ancient kings fight wars like you see in movies? Sometimes yes, but more often they fought with maps, minds, alliances, and fear. They knew that war was more than swords. It was about leadership. Today, kings and queens no longer ride to war, but the lessons of ancient rulers about courage, wisdom, and power still echo through history. Here's your question. If you were a king or queen in ancient times, would you fight with your soldiers or command from the shadows? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this journey through history, subscribe for more documentaries that bring the past to life.